You could join us for this message on Shabbat or whatever day you're watching and wherever you connect from. If you're watching on the Restoration app, shalomseattle.com, Facebook, YouTube, however you connect with us, we are glad that you are with us. We're continuing this series, Inside and Outside. It's the fifth message in this series about congruence in the life of Joseph from the book of Genesis. Last time we were together, I built you up. Well, I tried to build you up. I hope you walked away from it being built up in a message called It's Not Just About You. And today, I'm going to tear you down a little bit. Well, and myself too, with a message called Because You're Dumb. I feel like this is the root of most of our problems. It's because we're dumb. Because I'm done. Dumb. Not done. Dumb. Charles Stanley, the great preacher, when asked to sum up his life in one sentence, said this. He said, "Obey God and leave all the consequences to Him." And it's crazy because that's how we find Joseph in the place that we are at in the book of Genesis and in the narrative of Joseph. We've been talking throughout the series about the word congruence, and the word congruence means in agreement or harmony. In geometry, it's figures that are identical in form, coinciding exactly when they're superimposed on the other. And we've asked these questions, which are important for our lives. Does your inside match your outside? Do you see yourself the way God sees you? Do you live like God is for you? And I've used this quote throughout the series from Eugene Peterson, who said, "The Christian life is the lifelong practice of attending to the details of congruence. Congruence between ends and means. Congruence between what we do and the way we do it. Congruence between what is written in the scripture and our living out what is written. Congruence between a ship and its prow. Congruence between preaching and living. Congruence between the sermon and what is lived in both preacher and congregation. The congruence of the word made flesh in Jesus with what is lived in our flesh." Simply, throughout this series, the word congruence comes down to what we believe is supposed to be equal to how we live. And it's not, for the most part, because we have difficulties understanding who we are and how God views us, and we struggle with our own identities. And Joseph, in this narrative in Genesis, is this amazing story of congruence that begins with pain that he experiences at 17 because he's thrown into a pit like he's being buried. He's dragged out of that pit, sold into slavery by his own brothers. And then it doesn't really get healed until he's 37 years old, 20 years later. Now, he's also one of the most important prototypes of Messiah Yeshua in the scriptures. And he learns over these 20 years how to make his inside and his outside match. And if we go back to one of the scriptures that we started with in the series, in the first message of this series called Holy Addition and Subtraction, in Matthew 7, Yeshua says this: "Stop judging so that you may not be judged. For with judgment, the judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the beam in your own?" Specks and beams are kind of funny, I think. Yeshua says, how will you say to your brother, "Let me take the speck out of your eye," and look, the beam is still in your own? So this idea of specks and beams is so interesting as Yeshua uses them, because you have a giant beam coming out of your eye, bro. Like, for real, it's like a stick. There's like this giant pole that's sticking out of your eye that represents your own issues, but we judge everybody else on their issues, which are actually a speck in comparison, in their eye, in comparison to the beam that's coming out of ours. But you can't see your own beam because it feels like and looks like a speck. But everybody else around you sees a beam. So Yeshua continues, and he says, "Hypocrite, first take the beam out of your own eye, And then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So this is a two-step program because there's still a speck in your brother's eye. But other people's beams are obvious to us, and it's because it's sticking out of their eyes. Like you know generally what people's issues are when you meet them and talk with them. And I know what your problem is, but when people tell us our problem, we don't think it's that big of a deal. It's just a speck. I don't know why you're fighting me over a speck, but it's an obvious beam to them. And here's the truth, and what we've been working on through this whole series. If you can deal with the beam in your own eye, first you have to admit it's a beam and stop pretending it's a speck. Then you have to deal with it, which I've used before from Mr. Rogers. Whatever is mentionable is manageable. It's being able to name something and own something that actually gives us the opportunity to then manage what we actually have to manage. So Yeshua continues and he says, "Do not give what is holy to dogs or throw your pearls before pigs. Otherwise, they'll trample them under their feet and then turn and rip you to shreds." Which is the whole idea of, man, if you deal with the wrong beam in somebody's eye and they can't deal with it, and you keep forcing to deal with a beam that they see as a speck, they're going to trample all over you. And you're going to get trampled on. And it brings us to this idea that it's not really about everyone else's stuff. It's not about the world. It's not about politics. It's not about whatever issue is making you the most upset, because all of those things are projections for the things that are actually happening on the inside that God is trying to make congruent with our outside, but we don't want it to be congruent. Sometimes we say we do, but the truth is we don't. Because when we come to terms with our own stuff, if we leave our stuff and don't come to terms with it, we get stuck where we are. But when you come to terms with your own stuff and start to name beams, and stop calling them specks, you come back to what we've been working through this whole series, which is revelation is new information. Transformation is a change that's based on that new information, but there's a gap between those two, and the gap is always longer than we want it to be because we've had new information and we want something to happen with the information, but God won't let it happen until the transformation takes place. And for Joseph, it takes 20 years. Interestingly, in my story, it's taken about 20 years also. And it's a struggle because you're dumb. Because I'm dumb. Because instead of actually doing the things that God has us to do and call the things that God wants us to call beams, we keep arguing over whether they're specks. And God's like, oh my gosh, there's a giant beam coming out of your face. But we don't want to believe it because we're dumb. And this is really where we find Joseph in the confrontation or the reconciliation, which is really a confrontation first, because, well, I think all reconciliation is a confrontation. And he lives out the quote that I began with from Charles Stanley. We're supposed to obey God and leave all the consequences to him. And gosh, I mean, this family, the family of the patriarchs and the matriarchs of Israel, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 sons, all of their wives, all of their kids, this is like the most dysfunctional family. If you read the story as it is, not even adding anything to it, and you understand them as human beings, you see them, like I did in the first message, Jerry. It's all through, like they would be on the show. Because he'd be like, tell me again about the concubines and the wives and I'm sorry, how many? Like, which one's the father? That's Maury Povich. But look, So we continue in Genesis 50, right after Jacob dies and leaves his sons, and actually they bury him and they're reunited. In Genesis 50 and verse 15, it says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father had died, they said, maybe Joseph will be hostile towards us and pay us back in full for all the evil we showed him. What goes around comes around, right? Payback, baby. We know you're going to take your shot now that dad's dead. Like, that's what's in their heart and in their minds. But the problem is they lie next. It says, so they charged Joseph, right? They stepped up to Joseph, probably on his throne again, and they said, hey, by the way, before his death, your father, which I love the play of this all through the narrative, your father, my father, my father. Now it's not their father, even though they're all brothers and they're all reconciled with each other, and they've been all living together in Goshen, in Egypt. Now it's, hey, Joseph, we just want you to understand that your father is also our father. But in this case, your father gave a command saying, you must say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgressions of your brothers and their sin because they treated you wrongly. Therefore, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. And then it just says, and Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Like, his brothers are lying to him. When did their father have a conversation with the 10 of them without Joseph there so that he could tell them? This is like the most Seattle passive-aggressive move. They're not even saying, hey, what if they just stepped up and said, Joseph, we're worried now that our father's dead that you're going to kill us and give us what we deserve. Instead, they went up and said, hey, Dad said to us before he died, by the way, I don't know, you weren't there. You were probably out. But he said to us to make sure that you forgive us for what we did. And I think this is the reason why Joseph just weeps. Because he stands there thinking, what are we even doing, guys? And I think the truth of what happens in the story and the narrative of Joseph is Joseph dealt with the beam in his own eye so he could deal with the speck in his brother's eyes. See, he could have compassion and empathy for even why they would lie at this moment because he understood that they were afraid. But there's only one problem. We don't believe in karma or vengeance or payback. Why would his brothers do that in this moment? Why would they lie? Because they were afraid. Why do we, when we're afraid, say crazy stuff and start to decide, man, I'm just going to pay everybody back for what they've done? I know why. It's because you're dumb. And it's because I'm dumb. And God's trying to get us out of being dumb and help us, give us everything we need to deal with our stuff. Deal with the beam in your own eye so that you can start taking specks out of everybody else's. It's what we talked about in the message last week. It's not just about you. It is about you and about your healing and about your deliverance and about your salvation. But it's also about those things so as you understand yourself and understand being healed and what that means, then you can be a part of healing others. We continue in Genesis 50 and verse 18. It says, and his brothers came down and fell before him and said, behold, we are your slaves. But Joseph said to them, guys, don't be afraid. For am I in the place of God? I actually, this week, took this verse and laminated it and put it on my desk. Because I think there's two parts to this. One, don't be afraid. Two, I'm not God. And Joseph is aware enough in knowing that his brothers are lying and that they're being passive aggressive to be able to look at them in the face and say, guys, you're doing this because you're afraid. It's okay. I understand why you're afraid, but I'm not God. Vengeance belongs to the Lord. That's not what we're going to do. And I think this is a great question to ask ourselves, or something we should be saying to ourselves often. Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? I mean, thank God I'm not. Thank God you're not. Because if we were God, we'd make a mess of the whole thing. Dr. Henry Cloud says it this way. I say it often to my kids, and they're frustrated with me because they can finish the sentence. The only control anyone has is self-control. Of course, in fights with my family, when I am quoting this, I then lose control and yell at them almost immediately after. And they feel terrible, and I feel terrible because I didn't operate in self-control. John Maxwell says it this way: I'm always one step away from stupid. Always. In every situation. I'm always one step away from stupid. Proverbs 26:11 says it this way: like a dog that returns to his vomit, so a fool repeats his folly. This is another one I quote so often to my kids that recently I started to say it, and one of my kids just a couple weeks ago cut me off and said, I know, so a fool returns to his folly. It's getting kind of annoying, Dad. And I said, yes, let it sink in until it's seared into your brain. Because the truth is, I didn't fully understand this until I got a dog during COVID. This is our COVID puppy. His name is Tony Bark. We got him, this was right when he was a puppy, and we got him in July of 2020. He's cute. Come on, even if you're not a dog person, which I'm kind of disgusted with myself that I'm a dog person now, because I didn't like dog people before I had a dog. And now I'm a dog person because I just showed a picture of my dog and I said it's cute. Okay, whatever. But here's the problem, even with this super cute dog, is when he throws up, he looks at it instantly and thinks that looks delicious, and he eats it. Which is why Proverbs says, like a dog who eats its own vomit, so a fool keeps returning to his folly. Joseph continues in Genesis 50, verse 20, and he says to his brothers, you yourselves planned evil against me. God planned it for good, in order to bring about what it is this day, to preserve the lives of many people. So, don't be afraid. I myself will provide food for you and your little ones. So he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. How could Joseph speak to his brothers with kindness when he knew they were lying to him? It's because he dealt with his own beam in his eye. And he knew that what they think is a speck is also a beam for them. But he could operate in compassion and empathy because he wanted to help them deal with the beam that they think is a speck. My counselor said it this way to me: you don't need the people who hurt you to understand for you to heal. But if you're always looking for, that's how they get you, always suspicious, you're never trusting, you're waiting for the other shoe to drop, you're believing that even though good things are going to happen, bad things are probably going to happen again. If you're waiting for it to all go south, or you say things like, I have to prove myself to those people, I have to prove them right, I have to prove them wrong, it's all the same. You don't have to prove yourself to anyone. Because remember, we said it in the message, don't forget, and be fruitful. Success is found in having a faithful and sincere heart. And this, the reason why Joseph can speak kindly to the people who hurt him, it shifts His interest is in showing grace, not getting revenge or proving himself to anyone, because we remember that the narrative of Joseph, as we talked about the last few weeks, is filled with this phrase, Adonai was with him, and Adonai made everything he set his hand to successful. The truth is, God is with you. God is with me, and he wants to make you successful, not in the way that you think success matters or what success is, but by giving you a faithful and sincere heart. The modern sage, Mr. Miyagi, said it this way in Karate Kid Part 2. For a person living with no forgiveness in heart, living even worse punishment than death. Rick Warren says it like this. The closer you get to God, the more patient you'll be. The further you get from God, the more bitter and angry. Here's my encouragement to you as I preach this message to myself in this ridiculous season that we call the never-ending, frustrating COVID situation. Let's stop being dumb. Now, what does it mean to stop acting dumb? And here's a few things for you. You don't need to try to control your life more. You need to release control to God. You don't need to run anymore. You need to rest in God. You don't need to plan the payback. You need to recognize that it's all been paid in full. My encouragement to you today, on whatever day you're watching this message, is stop being dumb and be obedient to Yeshua, who gave his life so that you could be more like him. So you can forgive, you can love, you can be a shadow of Yeshua himself, just like Joseph, which is the next message, the last message in this series on congruence in the life of Joseph, the inside and outside, that we would be just like Joseph, as Yeshua, our Messiah, is just like Joseph. And I'm going to show you how he's like Joseph and Joseph is like him, and how we are made to be like our Messiah, Yeshua, who experienced all kinds of suffering, but in his suffering still offered himself as a sacrifice for even the people who caused the suffering that he experienced. I love you guys so much, and we will see you next time as we finish this series.